In ancient Greece, you were never truly alone, and that was not a comforting thought. It was a warning. Every single moment of your life, from the instant you opened your eyes in the morning until you closed them at night, was a performance for an unseen audience. An audience of powerful and often bored gods and goddesses who sat on their thrones on Mount Olympus, looking down on the world of mortals as if it were a stage. Lycomedes knew this better than most. His grandfather had once boasted that he was a faster runner than Hermes, the messenger god. It was a foolish thing to say, a joke made after too much wine at a village festival. But the gods heard. They always heard. The next day, his grandfather, who had been the swiftest man in the village, woke up to find his legs were as heavy as stone. He could barely walk, let alone run. He spent the rest of his life shuffling through the dust, a living reminder that the gods were always listening. Their pride was as fragile as a bird's egg, and their anger was as swift as a lightning bolt. So, Lycomedes lay still. He did not dare to think a bad thought about the dawn. He did not complain in his mind about the chill in the air, or the ache in his back. He imagined Apollo, the god of the sun, preparing his golden chariot to ride across the sky. He pictured Apollo's keen eyes, which could see everything that the light touched. To think a negative thought about the dawn was to insult Apollo himself. And so, Lycomedes filled his mind with praise. He thought about the beauty of the first light, the way it chased away the shadows of the night, the way it promised a new day. He hoped Apollo would see his respect and spare him any trouble. This was the first rule of survival in ancient Greece. Your thoughts were not your own. They were whispers in the ears of the gods. If you felt a flicker of envy for your neighbor's healthy olive grove, you risked angering Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. If you looked at a beautiful woman with too much desire, you might catch the attention of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who could turn that desire into a dangerous obsession. Or worse, you might anger her husband, the powerful and jealous Hephaestus. Every feeling, every fleeting idea, had to be guarded. It was like living in a house with walls made of glass. You had no privacy, no secrets. Finally, when the first rays of sunlight streamed through the single small window in his home, Lycomedes slowly rose. He moved with a quiet reverence, as if he were in a temple. He washed his face with water from a clay basin, and as he did, he whispered a small prayer of thanks to Poseidon, the god of the sea, for the water that filled the earth. He dressed himself in his simple tunic, careful not to admire his own reflection for too long in the polished bronze shield that hung on the wall. To be too proud of your appearance was to challenge the gods themselves, to commit the sin of hubris. And hubris was a crime. The gods punished more severely than any other. He knew the stories. He had heard the whispers of what happened to those who thought too highly of themselves. They were turned into spiders, or their voices were stolen, or they were forced to stare at their own reflection for eternity, unable to look away. The world was a minefield of divine pride, and every step had to be taken with caution. The day had barely begun, and already Lycomedes had navigated a dozen potential disasters, all without leaving his small one-room house. The simple act of waking up was a test, a dangerous dance with the invisible powers that ruled the world, and the sun was only just beginning to climb. The rest of the day stretched before him, a long and winding path filled with unseen dangers and the ever-present, watchful eyes of the gods. He was just one man, small and insignificant, but in the grand theater of the cosmos, even the smallest actor had a part to play, and a single misspoken line could bring the entire production to a tragic end. This was the reality of his world, a world where the most dangerous thing you could do was forget, even for a moment, that you were being watched. Once Lycomedes had navigated the treacherous territory of his own mind, he faced the next challenge of the day, getting dressed. This was not a simple matter of choosing what was comfortable or clean. In ancient Greece, the clothes you wore were a message, a declaration of who you were, where you belonged, and, most importantly, where you did not. To wear the wrong thing was like shouting a challenge in a crowded marketplace. It was an invitation for trouble, not just from other people, but from the gods themselves. The fabric, the color, and even the way you fastened your tunic could mean the difference between a peaceful day and a terrible fate. Consider the story of a young woman named Ione. She was not a princess or a priestess. She was the daughter of a simple potter, and her days were spent helping her father shape clay on his wheel. Her hands were always dusty, and her clothes were plain, practical garments of undyed wool. But Ione had a secret wish. She dreamed of beauty. She would watch the wealthy women of the city pass by, their robes dyed in brilliant colors, deep purple from Tyre, bright red from the Kermes insect, sunny yellow from saffron. These colors were more than just pretty. They were a sign of power. Purple, for instance, was so expensive to make that only the richest and most powerful people could afford it. To wear purple was to say, I am important. I am close to the gods. One day, a trader from a distant land passed through Ione's village. He had a small piece of cloth, no bigger than a man's hand, dyed a brilliant, shocking blue. It was the color of the deepest sea, the color of the sky at twilight. He said it was a gift from a sea nymph. Ione's father, in a moment of rare generosity, traded one of his finest pots for the scrap of fabric. He gave it to Ione, thinking it would make a pretty ribbon for her hair. But Ione saw more than a ribbon. She saw a chance to feel beautiful, just for a moment. That evening, she carefully sewed the blue cloth onto the collar of her plain tunic. It was a tiny splash of color in a sea of brown and gray, a single beautiful note in a song of silence. The next day she wore her modified tunic to the market. She felt a thrill of pride as she walked, the little patch of blue like a secret jewel. But the looks she received were not of admiration. They were of suspicion, of anger. The other villagers saw the blue and did not think of beauty. They saw a girl trying to be something she was not. Who does she think she is? They whispered. Does she think she is better than us? Does she think she is a queen? The color marked her as an outsider, someone who did not know her place. It was a violation of the unspoken rules that held their world together. But the whispers of mortals were the least of her worries. The real danger came from above. The goddess Athena, the patron of weavers and craftspeople, saw the girl's tunic. Athena was a goddess of wisdom, but she was also proud. She saw the girl's clumsy stitches and the plainness of her robe, and she saw the brilliant blue as an insult to the craft of weaving. To her, it was a mockery of the fine, expensive robes worn by her priestesses. It was a sign of disrespect. And then there was Hera, the queen of the gods, whose eyes were always drawn to anything out of the ordinary. She saw a mortal girl drawing attention to herself, and Hera despised mortals who stepped out of line. A simple piece of cloth had made Ione a target for the two most powerful goddesses on Olympus. That afternoon, as Ione walked home, a sudden, freak storm gathered in the clear sky. A single bolt of lightning, bright and terrible, struck the ground right in front of her. It did not harm her, but the message was clear. When she got home, she found that the beautiful blue patch on her tunic had turned to ash, leaving a black, ugly scorch mark over her heart. She was safe, but she was marked. She had learned a hard lesson. In ancient Greece, your clothes were not for you. They were for everyone else. They were a uniform that told the world you understood the rules. To be plain was to be safe. To be simple was to be invisible. And in a world where the gods were always watching, being invisible was the most precious gift you could ever hope for. The simple act of choosing a garment was a negotiation with fate, and a single thread of the wrong color could unravel a life. Having survived the dangers of his own home, Lycomedes knew that the moment he stepped outside, the world would become infinitely more dangerous. His small house was a sanctuary, a tiny island of relative safety in a vast ocean of peril. The path that led from his door to the village was not just a strip of dirt. It was a gauntlet. Every tree, every shadow, every bend in the road could be hiding something that wanted to kill him. The gods might be watching from above, but the monsters were right here on the ground. The forests of ancient Greece were not the peaceful, quiet places we imagine today. They were dark and tangled, filled with things that had teeth and claws. There were bears in the mountains, great shaggy beasts with the strength of 10 men. There were packs of wolves that hunted in the twilight, their howls echoing through the valleys like a death rattle. And there were wild boars, creatures of immense size and fury, with tusks as sharp as daggers. To meet one of these animals on the path was often a death sentence. A farmer on his way to the fields, a messenger carrying a letter, a child sent to fetch water from the spring. Any of them could vanish into the woods, their screams swallowed by the rustling leaves. There was a story they told in Lycomedes' village about a man named Orestes. He was a hunter, and he was proud of his skill. He claimed he could track any animal, kill any beast. One day, he went into the forest to hunt a great stag that had been seen near the village. He did not return. A week later, a search party found him, or what was left of him. He had been torn apart, his spear broken, his body mangled beyond recognition. The tracks around him told the story. He had found his stag, but he had also found a pack of wolves. He had been so focused on his prey that he had become prey himself. The forest did not care how brave you were, or how skilled. It was a place of hunger, and it would eat anyone who was not careful. But the animals were only half the danger. The other half was human. The roads between cities were not policed. There were no guards, no patrols. The only law was the law of the strongest. Bandits and thieves haunted the lonely stretches of road, waiting for travelers to pass. They would hide in the rocks, their faces covered, their swords drawn. They would strip a merchant of his goods, a traveler of his coins, and often they would take his life as well, leaving his body for the crows. To travel alone was to be a target. To travel in a small group was to be a slightly bigger target. The only safety was in numbers, in large caravans with armed guards, but that was a luxury few could afford. Lycomedes himself had a cousin who had been a victim of such an attack. His cousin, a man named Damon, had been traveling to the next town to sell a goat. It was a journey of only a few hours, on a road he had walked 100 times before. But on that day, 3 men jumped out from behind a cluster of olive trees. They took his goat, his money, and the new sandals his wife had made for him. They beat him and left him bleeding on the side of the road. He was lucky. He had survived. But he was a changed man. He never walked that road again without a spear in his hand and a look of fear in his eyes. So, as Lycomedes stepped out of his door, he did not simply walk. He listened. He watched. He carried a heavy wooden staff, not just for support, but for protection. He stayed in the middle of the path, away from the shadows where a wolf or a bandit might be hiding. He walked with a purpose, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. The journey to the village was only a mile, but it was a mile of constant gnawing anxiety. The world outside his door was a wild and brutal place, a place where the rules of civilization were a thin and fragile veneer. And as he walked, he knew that the greatest dangers of his day were still to come. The path was just the beginning. It was a test of his senses, a reminder that in this world, survival was not a right. It was a victory, one careful step at a time. As Lycomedes continued his journey, the path began to wind through a grove of ancient olive trees. The air grew still and cool, and the sunlight dappled through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the ground. This was not just any grove of trees. This was a sacred space, a place where the gods were not just watching, but were actively present. Every rock, every tree, Every rustle of leaves was imbued with a divine energy. To enter such a place was to walk into the house of a god, and you had to behave as a guest, a very humble and very careful guest. In ancient Greece, the world was dotted with these sacred places. A spring of pure water bubbling from the earth might be the home of a nymph. A cave deep in the mountains could be a gateway to the underworld. A grove of oak trees might be the personal sanctuary of Zeus himself. There were no signs, no fences, no warnings that a mortal could easily read. You were simply expected to know. You were expected to feel the change in the air, to recognize the hush that fell over the world, and to understand that you were treading on holy ground. To make a mistake here was not just foolish, it was fatal. There was a famous story, a story that every child in Greece knew, about a hunter named Actaeon. He was a good man, a skilled hunter, but he was careless. One day, while chasing a deer, he stumbled into a clearing deep in the woods. It was a beautiful place with a crystal-clear pool of water surrounded by flowers. But it was not for him. It was the sacred bathing place of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and the wilderness. And as Actaeon pushed aside the last branch, he saw her. The goddess, in all her divine glory, was bathing in the pool, her silver bow and arrows resting on the bank. For a mortal to see a god in their true form was a forbidden act. It was a violation of the most fundamental law of the cosmos. The gods were not meant for mortal eyes. Their power, their beauty, their very essence was too much for a human mind to comprehend. Artemis, enraged and violated, did not hesitate. She did not give him a chance to apologize, to explain that it was an accident. She simply scooped up a handful of water and threw it at him. As the droplets touched his skin, he began to change. His neck grew long, his skin turned to fur, and great antlers sprouted from his head. He had been turned into a stag. His own hunting dogs, the loyal companions who had followed him for years, caught his scent. They did not see their master. They saw a magnificent deer, a prize to be hunted. They fell upon him, their teeth tearing at his flesh, their barks of excitement echoing through the sacred grove. He tried to scream, to call out his name, but the only sound that came from his throat was the terrified braying of a stag. He died there, in the sacred grove, torn apart by his own dogs, a victim of a single forbidden glance. This story was a brutal reminder of the rules. You did not enter a sacred space without permission. You did not look upon the divine. You did not interrupt the gods in their private moments. And so, as Lycomedes walked through the olive grove, he kept his eyes on the path. He did not look too closely at the gnarled trunks of the ancient trees. He did not listen to the whispers of the wind in the leaves. He did not allow his mind to wander. He walked with a sense of purpose, but also with a deep and abiding fear. He was a trespasser here, an intruder in a world that was not his own. He knew that even a seemingly innocent action could be a grave offense. To break a branch from a sacred tree, to drink from a holy spring, to disturb a stone that had been left as an offering. Any of these things could bring down the wrath of a god. He walked on, his heart pounding in his chest, until he finally emerged from the grove and saw the village in the distance. He had made it through another sacred space, another test of his knowledge and his reverence. But the day was still young. The world was full of hidden temples and unseen altars, and a single misstep could still lead to a fate as terrible as Actaeon's. The gods were jealous of their privacy, and their punishment for those who violated it was swift, and it was absolute. For many in ancient Greece, the sea was not a choice, it was a necessity. The land was rugged and mountainous, making travel by foot slow and dangerous. The sea, by contrast, was a great flat highway, a network of shimmering roads that connected islands and cities. It was the lifeblood of trade, the source of food, and the only way to reach distant lands. But the sea was not empty. It was a kingdom, and it had a king. His name was Poseidon, and he was the most unpredictable and violent of all the gods. To set sail upon the water was to place your life directly in his hands, and his moods were as shifting and as treacherous as the tides. A storm at sea was not just a weather event, it was a manifestation of divine anger. The wind that tore at the sails, the waves that crashed over the deck, the rain that fell in blinding sheets. All of it was a message from Poseidon. It meant he was displeased. Perhaps a sailor had forgotten to make the proper sacrifice before leaving port. Perhaps a captain had boasted of his skill, claiming he could conquer the waves. Or perhaps Poseidon was simply in a foul mood, his rage stirred by some argument with his brother Zeus or his queen Amphitrite. The reason did not matter. When the sea grew angry, mortals paid the price. There is a story of a fisherman named Glaucus. He was a simple man who lived in a small village by the sea. He knew the water better than anyone. He knew the currents, the winds, and the secret places where the fish were plentiful. He respected the sea, and he always made sure to leave an offering for Poseidon on the shore before he cast his nets. One day, he sailed farther than usual, chasing a school of silver-finned tuna. The sun was bright, the water was calm, and his nets were full. It was a perfect day. As he was pulling in his final net, heavy with fish, he saw something strange. A single perfect pearl, gleaming in the sunlight, was tangled in the ropes. It was larger than any pearl he had ever seen, and it seemed to glow with an inner light. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was no ordinary pearl. It belonged to the sea. It belonged to the nymphs, the daughters of Poseidon. To take it would be a theft from the god himself. But the pearl was so beautiful, so valuable, it could feed his family for a year. He hesitated for only a moment, but a moment was all it took. He plucked the pearl from the net and hid it in his pouch. As soon as the pearl was out of the water, the world changed. The sky, which had been a brilliant blue, turned a dark and bruised purple. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, began to howl like a hungry wolf. The sea, which had been as flat as glass, rose up in great monstrous waves, their crests like angry teeth. Glaucus's small boat was tossed about like a child's toy. The waves crashed over him, trying to tear the stolen pearl from his grasp. He knew what he had done. He had angered the king of the sea. In a panic, he pulled the pearl from his pouch and threw it back into the churning water. The moment it touched the waves, the storm ceased. The wind died down, the sea grew calm, and the sun broke through the clouds. But the message had been sent. Glaucus sailed home, his nets empty, his heart filled with a terror that would never leave him. He had learned that the sea was not just a place to find food. It was a place of immense and terrifying power. Its treasures were not for mortals to take. Its beauty was a mask, hiding a rage that could swallow a man whole. Every sailor, every fisherman, every merchant who set foot on a boat knew this. They knew that their lives depended on the whims of a god who could be as gentle as a summer breeze one moment and as destructive as a hurricane the next. They would paint eyes on the prows of their ships, hoping to see the danger before it struck. They would carry charms and whisper prayers, hoping to appease the great god of the deep. But they knew, in their hearts, that the sea was a wild and untamable thing. It did not care about their prayers or their charms. It cared only about respect. And for those who failed to show it, the sea was a swift and merciless executioner. To survive a journey on its waters was to have looked into the face of a god's fury and, for a brief and precious moment, to have been spared. After surviving the perils of the wild and the divine, arriving at the village should have been a relief. Here, among the familiar sights and sounds of human life, one might expect to find safety. But the agora, the central marketplace and gathering place of the village, had its own set of dangers, as subtle and as deadly as any monster in the woods. The agora was the heart of the community, a place of commerce, politics and social life. But it was also a place of gossip, envy, and sudden, unpredictable violence. The rules here were not written in stone, they were written in the shifting sands of public opinion, and to misstep was to risk your reputation, your freedom, and even your life. The agora was a whirlwind of activity. Merchants shouted their prices, their tables piled high with everything from gleaming pottery to fragrant spices. Farmers displayed their produce, their baskets overflowing with olives, figs, and grapes. Craftsmen worked in their open-air workshops, the sound of hammers on metal and saws on wood filling the air. It was a place of opportunity, a place to buy, to sell, to trade, to connect. But with every transaction, there was a risk. To argue too loudly over the price of a fish could be seen as a sign of disrespect. To accidentally bump into a powerful citizen could be taken as an insult. The air was thick with the potential for conflict. There was a story told in whispers about a man named Phidias. He was a stonemason, known for his skill and his quick temper. One day, in the agora, he was arguing with a merchant over the quality of a piece of marble he had purchased. The merchant, a man with powerful friends, claimed that Phidias was trying to cheat him. Phidias, in a fit of anger, called the merchant a liar. It was a common insult, a word spoken 100 times a day in the heat of argument. But on this day, the merchant's powerful friends were nearby. They heard the insult, and they saw it as an attack on their own honor. A crowd gathered, drawn by the shouting. The mood shifted in an instant. The friendly buzz of the market was replaced by an angry murmur. The crowd became a mob, and the mob needed a target. Phidias, who only moments before had been a respected craftsman, was now an enemy of the people. The mob surged forward, their faces twisted with a sudden, shared rage. They dragged Phidias from the marketplace, ignoring his pleas for mercy. They took him to the edge of the village and, in a frenzy of violence, they stoned him to death. His crime? A single angry word spoken at the wrong time, to the wrong person. This was the danger of the agora. It was a place where a personal dispute could become a public execution in the blink of an eye. The crowd was a beast, a many-headed monster with no memory and no conscience. It could be swayed by a clever word, a rumor, a gesture. It could turn on you for no reason at all, simply because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. To navigate the agora was to walk a tightrope. You had to be polite, but not too friendly. You had to be confident, but not too proud. You had to be aware of everything around you, the shifting alliances, the sudden tensions, the whispers that could blossom into a roar. And the gods were watching here, too. Hermes, the god of commerce and thieves, was the patron of the marketplace. He delighted in clever deals and quick wits, but he also despised cheats and liars. To be dishonest in the agora was to risk his wrath, and Dionysus, the god of wine and madness, was always present, his influence lurking in the wine shops that lined the square. A single cup of wine could loosen your tongue, make you say something you would regret, and, in the agora, regret was a luxury you could not afford. So, as Lycomedes entered the agora, he pulled his cloak a little tighter around him. He kept his eyes down, his expression neutral. He moved through the crowd with a quiet purpose, avoiding arguments, ignoring the taunts of the idle and the boasts of the proud. He was a ghost in the machine, a silent observer in a world of noise and chaos. He knew that the greatest danger in the agora was not the cutpurse or the cheat. It was the crowd itself, the mindless, hungry beast that could turn a day of commerce into a day of blood and terror. And as he made his way to the stall where he would buy his daily bread, he knew that he was not just a customer, he was a survivor. In the heart of the agora, there was a raised stone platform called the bema. This was the stage for a particularly dangerous form of theater, public speaking. Here, in the assembly, any freeman could, in theory, stand up and voice his opinion on the matters of the city. It was the cornerstone of their democracy, a symbol of their freedom. But in practice, it was a minefield of pride, jealousy, and divine retribution. To speak in the assembly was to willingly place your head in the jaws of a lion. The lion was hubris, the sin of excessive pride, and the gods were always watching, waiting for it to rear its ugly head. Hubris was the most dangerous crime a mortal could commit. It was more than just arrogance. It was the act of forgetting your place in the cosmos. It was believing, even for a moment, that you were equal to the gods. And there was no place where this sin was more tempting than on the bema. When a man stood before the crowd, when he felt the power of their attention, when his words began to sway their opinions, it was easy to feel important. It was easy to feel that his ideas, his plans, his wisdom were the most important things in the world. And that was the moment the gods would strike. There was a cautionary tale whispered among the old men of the city, a story about a man named Chilon. He was not a king or a general, but he was a powerful speaker. His voice was like honey, and his arguments were as sharp as a sword. When he spoke in the assembly, the people listened. He proposed new laws. He argued for wars. He shaped the future of the city with his words. He became so successful, so admired, that he began to believe his own rhetoric. He began to see himself not as a servant of the people, but as their savior. One day, after a particularly successful speech, a supporter in the crowd shouted, "Chilon speaks with the wisdom of Zeus." It was a flattering comparison, but it was a dangerous one. Chilon, instead of humbly deflecting the praise, smiled and nodded. He accepted the comparison. In that moment, he had crossed a line. He had allowed a mortal to compare him to the king of the gods, and he had not corrected him. He had, in his heart, agreed with the sentiment. The real Zeus, on his throne on Mount Olympus, heard the shout. He saw the proud smile on Chilon's face, and his anger was swift and terrible. He did not strike Chilon down with a thunderbolt. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, he chose a more subtle, more cruel punishment. From that day forward, Chilon's gift of speech began to betray him. In the middle of a passionate argument, he would suddenly forget his words. He would stammer and stutter, his brilliant thoughts turning to dust in his mouth. The crowds that had once listened in rapt attention now began to snicker. His powerful voice became a weak and reedy whisper. His political enemies, seeing his weakness, pounced. They accused him of corruption, of treason. The very people who had once hailed him as a hero now turned on him, their admiration replaced with contempt. Chilon, the man who had once commanded the city with his voice, was exiled, forced to live out his days in a remote and lonely village, his mind still sharp, but his tongue unable to form the words that had once been his glory. He was a living testament to the dangers of hubris. He had flown too close to the sun, and the gods had melted his wings. This was the fear that haunted every man who dared to speak in public. They knew that their words were being weighed, not just by the people, but by the gods. They had to choose their phrases carefully, to pepper their speeches with humility, to constantly remind the audience and themselves that they were merely mortals, guided by the will of the gods. To speak with confidence was necessary, but to speak with arrogance was to invite disaster. The bema was not just a stage for politics, it was a stage for a constant, terrifying drama, a drama in which a single proud word could be the final act of a tragedy. And so, the wise man, when he spoke with a tremor in his voice, a tremor of fear, a tremor of respect for the unseen audience that judged not only his words, but the pride that lay hidden in his heart. While the grand stage of the assembly had its obvious perils, a far more insidious danger lurked in the quiet corners of the agora, in the hushed conversations between neighbors, and in the secret thoughts of the human heart. This was the danger of gossip and envy. In a world where the gods were always listening, a whispered rumor could be as deadly as a sword, and a jealous thought could bring about a divine punishment. The gods in many ways were reflections of human emotions, and they were particularly sensitive to the green-eyed monster of envy. To envy your neighbor was not just a personal failing, It was an invitation for divine intervention. Consider the story of two weavers, Arachne and a woman named Lyra. They lived in the same village, and both were known for their skill at the loom. Lyra was a good weaver. Her tapestries were strong and well made, and she was respected for her craft. But Arachne was more than good. She was a genius. Her fingers danced across the loom, and the images she created were so lifelike that birds would try to peck at the woven fruit, and the painted waves seemed to crash against the shore. Her fame spread throughout Greece, and people would travel for miles just to see her work. Lyra watched Arachne's success with a growing bitterness in her heart. She saw the praise that was heaped upon her rival, and she felt a knot of envy tighten in her stomach. She began to whisper to the other villagers. "Arachne is too proud," she would say. "She boasts that she is a better weaver than the goddess Athena herself." This was a lie. Arachne was proud of her work, but she was not foolish enough to compare herself to a goddess. But the lie, once spoken, took on a life of its own. The rumor spread from house to house, from village to village, until it reached the ears of Athena on Mount Olympus. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, was also a proud and jealous goddess. The idea that a mortal, any mortal, would dare to claim superiority in her own domain was an unforgivable insult. She decided to visit Arachne and see for herself if the rumors were true. She disguised herself as an old woman and went to Arachne's workshop. She saw the magnificent tapestries, and she recognized the girl's genius. But she also saw the pride in Arachne's eyes, a pride that had been twisted by the false rumors into something that looked like arrogance. The disguised Athena challenged Arachne to a weaving contest. Arachne, full of youthful confidence and unaware of the danger, accepted. They set up their looms, and the contest began. Athena wove a tapestry that depicted the majesty of the gods, a scene of power and glory. Arachne, in a fatal act of defiance, wove a tapestry that showed the gods in a less flattering light. She depicted their foolish mistakes, their petty arguments, their moments of weakness and cruelty. It was a masterpiece of skill, but it was also a masterpiece of disrespect. When Athena saw Arachne's tapestry, her rage was absolute. She tore the beautiful work to shreds and struck the young weaver on the head. Arachne, terrified and humiliated, fled from the workshop and tried to hang herself from a tree. But Athena would not allow her such an easy escape. She transformed the girl into a spider, her fingers forever destined to spin webs, a constant nagging reminder of her pride and her skill. But what of Lyra, the woman whose envy had started it all? Her fate was more subtle, but no less terrible. The other villagers, seeing what had happened to Arachne, turned on Lyra. They knew that her gossip had been the spark that had ignited the goddess's wrath. They shunned her, refusing to buy her tapestries or even to speak to her. Her envy had not brought her success. It had brought her isolation and shame. She had poisoned her own well, and now she was forced to drink from it. This was the lesson that every Greek learned from a young age. To feel envy was to plant a seed of destruction. To speak gossip was to water that seed. And when the seed finally bloomed, it produced a flower of poison that could destroy not only its intended victim, but the gardener as well. In a world where the gods were always listening, a jealous heart was a dangerous thing, and a whispering tongue was a weapon that could bring down the wrath of heaven on everyone involved. In the cities of ancient Greece, mortals had created systems of justice. They had courts, judges, and laws carved into stone. They believed in evidence, in testimony, in the power of reason to determine guilt or innocence. But these mortal courts operated under a shadow, a higher jurisdiction that could overrule any verdict and ignore any appeal. This was the court of the gods. Divine justice was not based on evidence. It was based on the whims, the emotions, and the absolute unquestionable knowledge of the gods. And when mortal law and divine will came into conflict, there was no question as to which would prevail. A man named Lycurgus was once put on trial in the city of Thebes. He was accused of stealing a sacred golden chalice from the temple of Hera. The evidence against him was strong. A witness claimed to have seen him near the temple on the night of the theft. The chalice was found hidden in his home. In a mortal court, the case seemed clear. But Lycurgus was a wealthy and powerful man, and he was a cunning speaker. He argued that he had been framed by his enemies. He bribed witnesses to change their testimony. He hired the most skilled orator in the city to plead his case. And, against all odds, he was acquitted. The mortal court declared him innocent. Lycurgus walked free from the courthouse, a smug smile on his face. He had beaten the system. He had used his wealth and his wits to escape punishment. He held a great feast to celebrate his victory, boasting to his friends about how he had outsmarted the law. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. While he had been on trial in the court of men, he had also been on trial in the court of the gods. And the judge in that court was Hera herself, the queen of the gods, whose sacred chalice had been stolen. Hera had watched the entire trial from her throne on Olympus. She had seen the theft. She had heard the lies. She had witnessed the bribery. The verdict of the mortal court was meaningless to her. It was an insult to her divine authority. She did not send a lightning bolt to strike Lycurgus down. Her justice was more personal, more poetic. She decided to make his punishment fit his crime. He had stolen a symbol of her power, so she would strip him of his own. That night, as Lycurgus slept, a strange madness began to creep into his mind. He awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He looked at his wife sleeping beside him, and he did not see the woman he loved. He saw a lioness, ready to pounce. He looked at his sons, and he did not see his children. He saw a pair of snarling wolves. In his God-sent madness, he believed his own family was a pack of wild animals that had invaded his home. He grabbed a sword and, in a fit of terrifying violence, he killed them all. When the morning came, the madness left him. He stood in his home, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and children, the bloody sword still in his hand. The horror of what he had done crashed down upon him. He had not been killed, but his life was over. He had lost everything he held dear. His wealth, his power, his family. All of it was gone. He would live out the rest of his days as a broken man, haunted by the memory of his crime and the terrible, swift justice of the gods. This was the reality of the Greek world. Mortal laws were a fragile shield. They could offer some protection, some semblance of order. But they were powerless against the wrath of a god. The gods were the ultimate judges, juries, and executioners. Their court was always in session, and their verdicts were final. To be declared innocent by men meant nothing if you were guilty in the eyes of the gods. And their punishments were not designed to be fair. They were designed to be a lesson, a terrifying, unforgettable lesson in the absolute and inescapable power of divine justice. In ancient Greece, a meal was never just a meal. The act of eating was deeply intertwined with the act of worship. The gods, like mortals, were believed to enjoy the aroma of roasting meat, the taste of fine wine, and the sight of a well-prepared feast. But they were also incredibly particular about how these offerings were made. A sacrifice was a contract, a carefully negotiated transaction between the mortal and the divine. To get it right was to earn the favor of the gods. To get it wrong was to invite disaster. The dinner table was an altar, and a single mistake in etiquette could have fatal consequences. The most important rule was that the gods always got their share first. Before any mortal could take a bite, a portion of the food and drink had to be set aside for the divine. The best cuts of meat, the first fruits of the harvest, the finest cup of wine, all of it belonged to the gods. This was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a literal act of feeding the unseen powers that ruled the world. The smoke that rose from the altar was believed to carry the essence of the food to Mount Olympus, a fragrant and pleasing aroma that would satisfy the divine appetite. There is a story about a king named Tantalus, who was, for a time, a great favorite of the gods. He was so beloved that he was often invited to dine with them on Mount Olympus, a privilege granted to very few mortals. He sat at their table, he drank their nectar, and he ate their ambrosia, the food of the gods that granted immortality. But Tantalus was a proud and foolish man. He began to see himself as an equal to the gods, and he decided to test their omniscience. He invited the gods to a great feast in his own palace. He promised them a meal worthy of their greatness. The gods, pleased by his hospitality, accepted the invitation. But Tantalus had a dark and terrible secret. To see if the gods truly knew everything, he had killed his own son, Pelops, and cooked him into a stew. He served this horrific dish to the gods, watching their faces for any sign that they knew what they were eating. The gods, of course, knew immediately. The moment the stew was placed on the table, they recoiled in horror. All of them, that is, except for one. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, was so distraught over the recent kidnapping of her daughter Persephone that she was not paying attention. In her grief, she absent-mindedly ate a piece of the stew, the boy's shoulder. The rage of the gods was absolute. They had been tricked, insulted, and implicated in a crime of unimaginable horror. Their punishment for Tantalus was one of the most famous and terrible in all of Greek mythology. They reassembled the boy, Pelops, and brought him back to life, replacing the missing shoulder with a piece of ivory. Then they took Tantalus to the Underworld and placed him in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. He was to be tormented for all eternity by a burning thirst and a gnawing hunger. Whenever he bent to drink from the pool, the water would recede. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches would pull away. He was to be forever tantalized by the food and drink that was just out of his reach, a fitting punishment for a man who had so horribly misused the sacred act of a meal. This story, though extreme, was a powerful reminder of the rules. You did not trick the gods. You did not defile their food. You did not insult them at the dinner table. Every meal, from the grandest royal banquet to the humblest farmer's supper, was a sacred event. The rules had to be followed. The proper prayers had to be said. The correct portions had to be offered. To fail in any of these duties was to risk offending the most powerful beings in the universe, and their displeasure was a far more bitter pill to swallow than any poorly cooked meal. While the proper offering of food was a cornerstone of Greek religious life, there were some foods that were so utterly taboo, so deeply offensive to the gods and to the natural order of the world, that the mere act of consuming them was a crime of the highest magnitude. The story of Tantalus and his son Pelops was a chilling example of the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. To eat the flesh of another human being was to cross a line from which there was no return. It was an act that dissolved the very bonds of society and family, and it was a crime that the gods punished with a unique and terrifying ferocity. The horror of cannibalism was not just about the act of killing. It was about the profound disrespect it showed for the sanctity of the human body. In Greek thought, the body was a vessel, a temporary home for the soul. To treat it as mere meat, as something to be carved and consumed, was to deny the humanity of the victim. It was an act of ultimate degradation, and it was believed to pollute not only the person who committed the act, but the very land on which it took place. There is a lesser-known but equally disturbing story about a king of Arcadia named Lycaon. He was a man who, like Tantalus, had grown arrogant and disrespectful of the gods. He doubted their power, and he decided to put them to the test. Zeus, the king of the gods, heard of Lycaon's impiety and decided to visit him in disguise, pretending to be a humble traveler. He wanted to see for himself if the king was as wicked as the rumors claimed. Lycaon, suspecting the traveler's true identity, decided to perform his own twisted test. He welcomed the disguised Zeus into his palace and offered him a meal, but the meal was a monstrous trap. Lycaon had murdered a hostage, a young boy from a neighboring tribe, and had roasted his flesh, mixing it in with the other meat that was served at the feast. He believed that if the traveler was truly a god, he would know, and if he was just a man, he would unknowingly commit a terrible sin. Zeus, of course, was not fooled. The moment the dish was set before him, he knew. His rage was unlike anything the world had ever seen. He rose from the table, his disguise falling away, and his true divine form filled the hall with a blinding light. He overturned the table, sending the horrific feast crashing to the floor. He then turned his wrath upon Lycaon. He did not kill the king. Instead, he inflicted a punishment that would forever serve as a warning to those who would dare to follow in his footsteps. As Lycaon fled from the palace in terror, he began to change. His clothes turned to fur, his hands and feet became paws, and his voice became a savage howl. He was transformed into a wolf, the first of his kind. He was to be forever cursed with a hunger for flesh, a wild and untamable beast, a living symbol of his own monstrous crime. His name, Lycaon, became the root of the word lycanthropy, the mythical transformation of a man into a wolf. This story, and others like it, reinforced a powerful cultural taboo. The line between man and beast was a sacred one, and the act of eating human flesh was the ultimate violation of that line. It was a rejection of civilization, a descent into savagery. And the gods, who were the guardians of that civilization, would not tolerate it. The punishment for such a crime was not just death, but a transformation, a permanent branding of the soul that marked the offender as something less than human. The forbidden feast was a meal that, once tasted, could never be forgotten, and its price was the loss of one's own humanity. Wine was the lifeblood of ancient Greece. It was a gift from the gods, a source of joy, a social lubricant, and a central part of religious ritual. But the god who gave them this gift, Dionysus, was a dual-natured deity. He was the god of ecstasy and celebration, but he was also the god of madness and chaos. To drink wine was to invite his influence into your mind and body, and while a little of that influence could be a wonderful thing, too much of it could be a terrifying and destructive force. The wine cup was a vessel of transformation, and it could turn a man into a poet, a lover, a philosopher, or a monster. The Greeks understood this duality. They almost always mixed their wine with water, a practice that was seen as a mark of civilization. To drink wine undiluted was considered barbaric, a sign of a wild and uncontrolled nature. It was a deliberate choice to bypass the gentle, joyful side of Dionysus and to leap headfirst into his madness. The stories they told were full of warnings about the dangers of such a choice. One of the most famous of these stories is about the daughters of King Minos of Orchomenus. The king had 3 daughters, and they were known for their piety and their devotion to their work at the loom. They were quiet, serious women who had no time for the wild and chaotic celebrations of the new god Dionysus. While the other women of the city would run to the mountains to dance and sing in his honor, the daughters of Minos would stay at home, weaving and speaking ill of the god and his followers. Dionysus, being a new god, was particularly sensitive to insults. He would not tolerate being ignored. He came to the daughters of Minos in the disguise of a young girl and warned them to stop their work and join his festival. He told them of the joy, the freedom, the divine ecstasy that could be found in his worship. But the sisters laughed at him. They told him to go and play with the other foolish girls. They were sensible women, and they had work to do. The god's patience was at an end. His disguise fell away, and he revealed his true divine nature. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of unseen drums and pipes. The threads on the looms of the sisters began to transform, turning into writhing snakes and dripping with wine. The air grew thick with the scent of unseen panthers and lions. The sisters, terrified, tried to flee, but it was too late. The gods' madness had taken hold of them. In their frenzy, they were overcome with a horrific, bloodthirsty rage. They saw one of their own children, a young boy named Hippasus, and in their wine-fueled madness, they mistook him for a young deer. They fell upon him, tearing him limb from limb in horrific parody of a Dionysian sacrifice. When the madness finally left them, they were standing over the mutilated body of their own child, their hands and clothes stained with his blood. Horrified by what they had done, they fled into the mountains, but there was no escape from the god's wrath. He transformed them into bats, creatures of the night, forever destined to shun the light of the sun and to live in the dark and lonely places of the world. Their story was a brutal and terrifying lesson. To reject Dionysus was as dangerous as to embrace him too fully. He was a god who demanded to be acknowledged, and his influence could not be ignored. The wine he gave to mortals was a test, a challenge to find the balance between civilization and savagery, between reason and madness. And for those who failed that test, the consequences were swift and they were absolute. In the rugged and often dangerous world of ancient Greece, the concept of hospitality, known as xenia, was not just a matter of good manners. It was a sacred duty, a cornerstone of their moral code. Xenia was the unwritten law that governed the relationship between a host and a guest. It dictated that a host must welcome any stranger into their home, offering them food, drink, and a place to sleep without asking their name or their business until they were refreshed. In return, the guest was expected to be respectful, to not abuse the host's generosity, and to offer a gift if they were able. This sacred bond was overseen by Zeus himself, who was known as Zeus Xenios, the protector of strangers. To violate the laws of Xenia was to risk the wrath of the king of the gods. This system was a vital part of Greek society. In a world with few inns and dangerous roads, travelers were completely dependent on the kindness of strangers. Xenia created a network of trust and mutual obligation that allowed for trade, communication, and cultural exchange. But it was also a system that was ripe for abuse, and the stories of the Greeks are filled with tales of both exemplary hospitality and its horrific violation. The relationship between host and guest was a double-edged sword, and a single act of disrespect could have devastating consequences. One of the most famous examples of xenia in action is the story of Bacchus and Philemon. They were a poor elderly couple who lived in a humble cottage in the hills of Phrygia. One day, two strangers came to their village seeking shelter for the night. They went from door to door, from the grandest mansion to the most comfortable farmhouse, and everywhere they were turned away. The villagers were suspicious and unwelcoming. Finally, the two strangers came to the small, dilapidated cottage of Bacchus and Philemon. The old couple, despite having very little themselves, welcomed the strangers with open arms. They offered them their only chair, they washed their feet, and they prepared a simple meal of cabbage, bacon, and wine. As they were serving the wine, they noticed something miraculous. No matter how many cups they poured, the wine pitcher never emptied. It was constantly refilling itself. It was then that they realized their guests were not mortal men. They were Zeus and Hermes, who had come to Earth in disguise to test the hospitality of mortals. Terrified that their humble meal was not enough for the gods, Bacchus and Philemon decided to kill their only goose, who was both a pet and the guardian of their home. But as they tried to catch the goose, it ran to Zeus for protection. The gods then revealed themselves and told the old couple that they would be spared from the punishment that was about to befall their inhospitable village. They led Bacchus and Philemon to the top of a nearby mountain, and from there they watched as a great flood destroyed the village and everyone in it. Their own small cottage was transformed into a magnificent temple of gold and marble, and the gods granted them their dearest wish, to be the guardians of the temple and to die at the same moment, so that neither would have to live without the other. When their time came, they were transformed into two trees, an oak and a linden, their branches intertwined for all eternity. This story was a beautiful illustration of the rewards of true xenia. But for every story of Baucis and Philemon, there was a darker tale, a story of hospitality violated. The entire Trojan War, for example, was sparked by a violation of xenia. Paris, a prince of Troy, was a guest in the home of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. He abused his host's hospitality by seducing his wife, Helen, and taking her back to Troy. This act of betrayal led to a 10-year war that destroyed a city and killed thousands. It was a brutal and bloody reminder that the laws of hospitality were not to be taken lightly. To be a good host was to be a good person. To be a bad guest was to invite the wrath of both men and gods. In the world of ancient Greece, to be noticed by a god was perhaps the most dangerous thing that could happen to a mortal. While the gods could be generous and protective, their attention was often a curse disguised as a blessing. This was never more true than when a god's attention turned to desire. The love of a god was a consuming fire, a force of nature that a mortal could not hope to withstand. It was a love that did not ask for consent, that did not care about the consequences, and that often left a trail of tragedy and heartbreak in its wake. For a mortal woman to become the object of a god's desire was not a fairy tale. It was a nightmare. The stories of the god's mortal lovers are numerous, and they almost always end in sorrow. The god, usually Zeus, would see a beautiful mortal woman and would be overcome with an irresistible lust. He would pursue her relentlessly, often using trickery and deception to get what he wanted. He would disguise himself as an animal, a bird, or even the woman's own husband. The woman, in most cases, had no choice in the matter. To resist a god was to invite a terrible punishment, but to submit was to step into a world of danger and divine politics that she was not equipped to handle. One of the most tragic of these stories is the tale of Semele, a princess of Thebes. She was a beautiful young woman who caught the eye of Zeus. He came to her in the guise of a mortal man, and she fell in love with him, not knowing his true identity. She soon became pregnant with his child. But their affair was discovered by Hera, Zeus's jealous and vengeful wife. Hera was the eternal enemy of her husband's mortal lovers, and her wrath was legendary. Hera came to Semele in the disguise of an old nurse. She planted a seed of doubt in the young woman's mind. "If your lover is truly Zeus," the disguised goddess whispered, "then why does he not come to you in his true form? Why does he hide his glory from you? Perhaps he is not a god at all. Perhaps he is a liar who is trying to trick you." Semele, young and foolish, listened to the old woman's poisonous words. The next time Zeus came to her, she made him promise to grant her one wish. Zeus, deeply in love, swore a sacred and unbreakable oath on the river Styx that he would grant her whatever she desired. It was then that she made her fatal request. "I want you to come to me as you come to Hera. I want to see you in all your divine glory." Zeus was horrified. He knew what would happen. A mortal cannot look upon the true form of a god without being destroyed. He begged her to change her mind, but she refused. He was bound by his oath. With a heavy heart, he returned to Mount Olympus and gathered his thunderbolts, his lightning, his full, terrifying, and magnificent divine power. He returned to Semele's chambers, and the moment he appeared, she was consumed by the flames of his glory. She was burned to a crisp, a tragic victim of her own foolish wish and the cruel machinations of a jealous goddess. Zeus, however, managed to save their unborn child. He snatched the baby from the ashes of its mother and sewed it into his own thigh, carrying it until it was ready to be born. This child was Dionysus, the god of wine and madness, a god who was twice born, once from a mortal mother and once from a divine father. His very existence was a testament to the dangerous and often fatal consequences of a god's desire. The love of a god was not a gentle thing. It was a storm, a fire, a force that could create a new god and destroy a mortal life in the very same breath. If the desire of a male god was a dangerous fire, then the jealousy of his wife, Hera, was a relentless, all-consuming inferno. As the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage and childbirth, Hera considered any of her husband's infidelities to be a direct attack on her own honor and authority. But she could not punish Zeus, the king of the gods. So, she directed her legendary wrath at his mortal lovers and their innocent children. To be the target of Hera's jealousy was to be condemned to a life of suffering, to be hunted, tormented, and pursued to the ends of the earth by a goddess who never forgave and never forgot. The list of Hera's victims is long and tragic. She was a master of psychological torture, of cruel and unusual punishments that were designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain and suffering. She did not just kill her rivals, she destroyed their lives, their families, and their sanity. Her jealousy was a creative and terrifying force, and it shaped the destinies of some of the greatest heroes and monsters in Greek mythology. One of her most famous victims was Leto, a gentle titaness who became pregnant with Zeus's children, the twins Apollo and Artemis. When Hera discovered the affair, she was enraged. She decreed that Leto would not be allowed to give birth on any land that was touched by the sun. She then sent a monstrous serpent, the Python, to hunt Leto across the face of the earth. The pregnant Titaness wandered for months, friendless and terrified, unable to find a single place to rest. Every city, every island, every patch of solid ground feared Hera's wrath and turned her away. Finally, she found a small, barren floating island named Delos. Because it was not attached to the seabed, it was not considered to be land, in the strictest sense of the word, and so it was not subject to Hera's curse. It was on this desolate rock that Leto, in agony and exhaustion, finally gave birth to her divine children. But Hera's torment did not end there. She continued to persecute Leto and her children for years, her jealousy a constant, menacing shadow in their lives. Another of Hera's victims was a woman named Callisto, a beautiful nymph who was a follower of the virgin goddess Artemis. Zeus, in his usual deceptive fashion, disguised himself as Artemis to get close to Callisto and seduce her. When Callisto became pregnant, her condition was discovered by the real Artemis, who was enraged that one of her followers had broken their vow of chastity. She banished Callisto from her sacred band of huntresses. But this was only the beginning of the poor nymph's suffering. Hera, of course, soon learned of the affair. She came to the distraught and lonely Callisto and, in a fit of rage, transformed her into a bear. The once beautiful nymph was now a lumbering, shaggy beast, unable to speak, unable to explain what had happened to her. She was hunted by men, feared by other animals, and separated from her own son, Arcas, who was raised by others. Years later, Arcas grew up to be a skilled hunter. One day, while hunting in the forest, he came across a large bear. It was his mother, Callisto. She recognized her son and tried to run to him to embrace him. But Arcas saw only a dangerous animal charging at him. He raised his spear, ready to kill his own mother. In that moment, Zeus, who had been watching from above, finally took pity on the woman he had so carelessly ruined. To prevent the tragedy, he transformed both mother and son into constellations and placed them in the sky. Callisto became Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and Arcas became Ursa Minor, the Little Bear. They were to be a permanent reminder, etched in the stars, of the terrible, enduring, and inescapable consequences of Hera's jealousy. To be loved by Zeus was a curse, but to be hated by Hera was a fate worse than death. In a world where the gods could see the future, the gift of prophecy was a double-edged sword. To know what was to come might seem like a blessing, a way to avoid disaster and to secure a happy fate. But more often than not, a prophecy was a burden, a heavy chain that bound a person to a predetermined destiny. This was especially true in matters of the heart. A prophecy could poison a relationship before it even began, turning love into fear and joy into a constant gnawing anxiety. The knowledge of the future did not set people free. It trapped them in a story that had already been written. The most famous story of a prophecy-doomed love is that of Oedipus. It began not with Oedipus himself, but with his father, Laius, the king of Thebes. Laius received a terrifying prophecy from the oracle at Delphi. He was told that if he ever had a son, that son would grow up to kill him and marry his own mother. The prophecy was so horrific that Laius and his wife Jocasta decided to defy it. When Jocasta gave birth to a son, they did not dare to kill the child themselves. Instead, they pierced his ankles and gave him to a shepherd, with instructions to leave the baby to die on a remote mountainside. But fate, in the Greek world, was not so easily cheated. The shepherd took pity on the baby and gave him to another shepherd, who in turn gave him to the childless king and queen of Corinth. They named the boy Oedipus, which means swollen foot, and raised him as their own son. Oedipus grew up believing he was the prince of Corinth, but as a young man he heard a rumor that he was adopted. He traveled to the oracle at Delphi to ask about his true parentage. The oracle did not answer his question. Instead, it gave him the very same prophecy that had been given to his father, that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, and still believing the king and queen of Corinth were his real parents, Oedipus resolved never to return to Corinth. He fled, hoping to outrun his terrible fate. As he was traveling on the road to Thebes, he came to a place where three roads met. There he had an argument with a man in a chariot over who had the right of way. The argument escalated into a fight, and Oedipus, in a fit of rage, killed the man and his servants. He did not know it, but the man he had killed was Laius, his true father. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled. Oedipus continued on to Thebes. He found the city in the grip of a terrible monster, the Sphinx, who killed anyone who could not answer her riddle. Oedipus, being a clever and resourceful young man, solved the riddle, and the Sphinx killed herself. The grateful people of Thebes hailed him as a hero and offered him the throne and the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta. He accepted, and so he married his own mother, fulfilling the second part of the prophecy. For many years, Oedipus and Jocasta lived in blissful ignorance. They had 4 children, and Oedipus ruled Thebes as a wise and just king. But then a terrible plague fell upon the city. Oedipus, determined to save his people, sought the advice of the oracle once more. He was told that the plague would not end until the murderer of King Laius was found and punished. In his desperate search for the killer, Oedipus slowly and horrifically uncovered the truth of his own birth. When the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, Jocasta, in her horror, hanged herself. Oedipus, in a fit of grief and despair, took the golden brooches from his dead mother's dress and blinded himself. He had spent his entire life trying to escape his fate, only to run headlong into its arms. The prophecy had not been a warning. It had been a script, and he had been an unwilling actor in a tragedy of cosmic proportions. In the Greek worldview, sin was not always a personal matter. The crimes of an individual could stain an entire family for generations. A curse, once uttered by a god or a wronged mortal, was a living, breathing entity, a hereditary disease of the soul that was passed down from parent to child. To be born into a cursed family was to be born into a story of tragedy that had begun long before you took your first breath. You were not responsible for the original crime, but you were destined to pay the price. The concept of inherited sin was one of the most terrifying and inescapable aspects of Greek fate. The most famous example of a cursed family is the house of Atreus. The curse began with Tantalus, the king who had tested the gods by serving them his own son Pelops in a stew. The gods punished Tantalus with an eternity of hunger and thirst, but their wrath did not end with him. The horrific act of cannibalism and filicide had poisoned his bloodline, and his descendants were doomed to repeat his crimes of betrayal and violence for generations to come. The curse passed to Tantalus's son, Pelops. Although he had been restored to life by the gods, he was still his father's son. He wanted to marry a beautiful princess named Hippodamia, but her father, King Oenomaus, had been warned by a prophecy that he would be killed by his son-in-law. To prevent this, he challenged every one of his daughter's suitors to a chariot race. If the suitor won, he could marry Hippodamia. If he lost, he would be killed. Oenomaus was an expert charioteer with magical horses given to him by his father, Ares, the god of war. He had defeated and killed 13 suitors before Pelops arrived. Pelops, knowing he could not win a fair race, resorted to trickery and betrayal. He bribed Oenomaus's charioteer, a man named Myrtilus, to replace the bronze linchpins of the king's chariot with wax ones. In exchange, he promised Myrtilus half of the kingdom and the first night with his new bride. During the race, the wax pins melted, the wheels of Oenomaus's chariot flew off, and the king was dragged to his death. Pelops had won, but he had done so through treachery. After the race, Pelops refused to honor his promise to Myrtilus. Instead, he threw the charioteer into the sea. As Myrtilus was drowning, he uttered a terrible curse upon Pelops and his entire family, calling upon the gods to avenge his betrayal. This new curse, laid on top of the original sin of Tantalus, sealed the fate of the house of Atreus. The curse continued to work its poison on the next generation. Pelops's 2 sons, Atreus and Thyestes, were locked in a bitter rivalry for the throne of Mycenae. Atreus, in an act of horrific revenge against his brother for seducing his wife, repeated the crime of their ancestor, Tantalus. He killed Thyestes' 2 young sons, cooked them, and served them to his brother at a feast. When Thyestes had finished his meal, Atreus brought out the heads and hands of his children, revealing the terrible truth of what he had done. Thyestes, in his grief and horror, uttered another curse upon his brother and his descendants. This relentless cycle of violence and betrayal continued for generations, a bloody inheritance passed down from father to son. The curse of the house of Atreus was a powerful and terrifying illustration of the Greek belief in inherited sin. It was a story that warned that the consequences of our actions do not die with us. They live on, shaping the lives of our children and our children's children, a dark and inescapable legacy written in the blood of our ancestors. In the Greek world, to be skilled at a craft was a gift from the gods. A potter who could shape a perfect vase, a musician who could play a beautiful melody, a weaver who could create a stunning tapestry. All of them owed their talent to the divine. To be proud of your work was natural, but to be too proud was to commit the sin of hubris, and to believe that your skill was your own, that it was not a gift from the gods, but a product of your own genius, was to challenge the gods in their own domain. This was a challenge that the gods never ignored, and their punishment was always swift and terrible. The story of Arachne, the weaver who was turned into a spider for challenging Athena, is a classic example of this. But there are many other, lesser-known stories that illustrate the same chilling lesson. One of these is the tale of Marsyas, a satyr from Phrygia. Satyrs were wild creatures of the forest, half man and half goat, known for their love of wine, music, and revelry. Marsyas was a particularly skilled musician. He played the aulos, a double-reeded pipe that could produce a haunting and beautiful sound. But the aulos had a strange and divine origin. It had been invented by the goddess Athena. She had tried to play it herself, but when she saw her reflection in a pool of water, she saw how puffing out her cheeks to play the instrument distorted her beautiful face. In a fit of vanity, she threw the instrument away and placed a curse on anyone who would pick it up. Marsyas, wandering in the forest, found the discarded olos. He did not know of the curse. He picked it up and began to play. He soon became a master of the instrument, and his music was so beautiful that it was said to charm the birds from the trees and the beasts of the forest. Marsyas grew proud of his skill. He began to boast that his music was more beautiful than the music of Apollo himself, the god of music, poetry, and the lyre. Apollo, like Athena, was a proud and jealous god. He would not tolerate a challenge from a mere satyr. He came down from Mount Olympus and challenged Marsyas to a music. The goddesses of the arts were to be the judges. In the first round, Marsyas played a beautiful melody on his aulos, a song of the earth, of the wild and untamed places of the world. The muses were enchanted. Then Apollo played his lyre, a song of the heavens, of order, harmony, and divine beauty. The muses were equally impressed. The contest was a tie. But Apollo was not finished. He then declared that the contestants must play their instruments upside down. Apollo, with his lyre, could easily do this, but Marsyas, with his olos, could not. The pipes had to be blown from the top. Apollo had won the contest through a trick. But winning was not enough for the proud and vengeful god. He had been challenged, and the challenger had to be punished. He took the unfortunate satyr, and, in a horrific act of cruelty, he flayed him alive, stripping the skin from his body while he was still conscious. He then nailed the skin to a pine tree, a gruesome trophy and a terrifying warning to any other mortal who might dare to challenge the gods in their own domain. The story of Marsyas is a brutal and disturbing one. It is a reminder that in the Greek world, skill was a dangerous thing. It was a gift that could be taken away at any moment. To excel was to walk a tightrope. You had to be good enough to be respected, but not so good that you attracted the attention of a jealous god. And you must never, ever forget that your talent was not your own. It was a loan from the divine, and the gods could call in that loan at any time, with devastating and terrifying interest. In the beginning, mortals lived in a state of ignorance and hardship. They shivered in the cold, ate their food raw, and stumbled through the darkness. They were little more than animals, and the gods, for the most part, ignored them. But then came Prometheus, a titan who had a deep and abiding love for humanity. He saw their suffering, and he decided to defy the will of Zeus, who had forbidden the sharing of divine knowledge with mortals. Prometheus stole fire from Mount Olympus, a spark of divine power, and brought it down to earth, a gift that would change the course of human history forever. Fire was more than just warmth and light. It was the foundation of civilization. With fire, mortals could cook their food, forge tools, build homes, and create art. It was the spark of invention, the beginning of all human progress. But like all gifts from the gods, even those given out of love, fire came with a price. Zeus, enraged by Prometheus's defiance, punished the Titan with an eternal torment, chaining him to a mountain and sending an eagle to eat his liver every day. But the punishment did not end with Prometheus. It extended to humanity as well. Zeus, in his anger, decided to send a counter-gift to mortals, a beautiful woman named Pandora. She was created by Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths, and endowed with gifts from all the other gods. But she also came with a jar, a beautiful, ornate vessel that she was forbidden to open. Pandora, driven by curiosity, eventually opened the jar, releasing all the evils of the world: sickness, old age, famine, war, and all the other miseries that plague humanity. Only hope remained at the bottom of the jar, a small, flickering flame in the face of overwhelming despair. This story was a powerful lesson about the nature of divine gifts and the dangers of forbidden knowledge. It taught that every invention, every step forward in human progress came with a hidden cost. Fire brought warmth, but it also brought the potential for destruction. Tools brought efficiency, but they also brought the means for war. Knowledge brought power, but it also brought suffering. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, understood that humanity was not ready for all the gifts of the cosmos. They understood that some knowledge was too dangerous, some power too great for mortal hands. There were other stories, too, of mortals who dared to invent things that challenged the natural order. Daedalus, the great inventor, created wings for himself and his son Icarus, allowing them to fly like birds. But Icarus, in his youthful exuberance, flew too close to the sun, and the wax that held his wings together melted, sending him plummeting to his death. His invention, a marvel of human ingenuity, became a symbol of human folly, a reminder that there were limits to what mortals could achieve, and that those limits were set by the gods. The rules of invention were clear. You could create, you could build, you could discover. But you must never forget the source of your inspiration. You must never forget that your genius was a gift, not an inherent right. And you must never, ever challenge the divine order. The gods had given humanity the spark of fire, but they had also given them the burden of suffering. And for every step forward that humanity took, there was a corresponding step backward, a reminder that the path of progress was paved with both triumph and tragedy, and that the ultimate control over their destiny remained firmly in the hands of the gods. For the vast majority of people in ancient Greece, life was inextricably linked to the land. Their survival depended on the generosity of the earth, on the cycles of planting and harvesting, on the rain that fell from the sky and the sun that warmed the soil. And the goddess who held dominion over all of this was Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, fertility, and the harvest. She was a benevolent goddess, a giver of life and abundance. But like all the gods, she was also capable of immense grief and terrible wrath. And when Demeter was unhappy, the earth itself suffered, and mortals starved. Demeter's moods were as unpredictable as the weather. A good harvest meant a year of plenty, of full bellies and happy families. A bad harvest meant hunger, disease, and death. And often, the reason for a bad harvest had nothing to do with the skill of the farmer or the quality of the soil. It had to do with the goddess herself, with her personal joys and sorrows, with her divine relationships and her cosmic dramas. The farmer's plight was a constant reminder that their lives were not their own. They were at the mercy of a goddess whose emotions could literally shape the landscape of their existence. The most famous story that illustrates Demeter's power over the earth is the myth of her daughter, Persephone. Persephone was a beautiful young goddess, full of life and joy. One day, while she was gathering flowers in a meadow, the earth suddenly opened up, and Hades, the grim king of the Underworld, emerged in his chariot. He snatched Persephone and dragged her down into his dark kingdom, intending to make her his queen. Demeter was heartbroken. She loved her daughter more than anything in the world, and her grief was absolute. She searched for Persephone for 9 days and 9 nights, her torch lighting the way, her cries echoing across the land. She neglected her duties as the goddess of the harvest. The fields withered, the crops died, and the trees stopped bearing fruit. A terrible famine spread across the earth. Mortals starved, and the altars of the gods grew cold, for there was no food to offer and sacrifice. Zeus, seeing the suffering of humanity and the dwindling offerings, finally intervened. He sent Hermes to the Underworld to demand Persephone's return. Hades, however, had tricked Persephone into eating a few pomegranate seeds while she was in the Underworld. This meant that she was bound to his kingdom for a portion of every year. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend 2/3 of the year with her mother in the world above, and 1/3 of the year with Hades in the Underworld. When Persephone returned to her mother, Demeter's joy was so immense that the earth burst forth with life. The fields became green again, the flowers bloomed, and the crops grew tall and abundant. This was spring and summer. But when Persephone returned to the underworld, Demeter's grief would return. The earth would become barren and cold, the trees would shed their leaves, and the land would lie dormant. This was autumn and winter. This myth was not just a story about the seasons. It was a profound explanation for the farmer's constant struggle. It taught that the abundance of the earth was not a given. It was a gift, a reflection of a goddess's love and sorrow. The farmer, toiling in the fields, was not just battling the elements or the pests. He was battling the emotions of a goddess. A sudden drought, a late frost, a blight on the crops. All of it could be traced back to Demeter's mood. And so, the farmer lived a life of constant prayer and careful observation, hoping to appease the goddess, hoping to catch her in a moment of joy, knowing that their very existence depended on the unpredictable and powerful emotions of the divine. In the Greek world, there was a power even greater than the gods themselves. This was the power of fate. Three ancient, terrifying goddesses, the Moirai or Fates, held dominion over the destiny of every living being, from the humblest mortal to the mightiest god. Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos, the eldest and most fearsome, cut it short. Their decisions were absolute, unchangeable, and inescapable. To be born into the Greek world was to be born with a predetermined destiny, a story that had already been written, and there was nothing, not even the will of Zeus, that could alter a single line. This belief in an unyielding fate was both a comfort and a terror. It was a comfort because it meant that the universe had a plan, that there was an order to the chaos of life. It was a terror because it meant that free will was an illusion, that every choice, every action, every triumph, and every tragedy was merely a step along a path that had already been laid out. To try to defy fate was not just foolish, it was an act of cosmic rebellion, and it always ended in failure. One of the most poignant stories illustrating the power of fate is that of Meleager, a hero of Calydon. His story began even before his birth. When his mother, Althea, was 7 days pregnant, the three fates appeared to her. Clotho spun the thread of his life, Lachesis measured it, and Atropos, the cutter, pointed to a log burning in the fireplace. She declared that Meleager would live only as long as that log remained unburned. Althea, terrified, immediately snatched the log from the fire, extinguished it, and hid it away in a chest, believing she could cheat fate. Meleager grew up to be a brave and strong warrior, a hero of many battles. He was destined to lead the hunt for the Caledonian boar, a monstrous beast sent by Artemis to punish the king of Calydon for neglecting her in his sacrifices. Meleager gathered the greatest heroes of Greece, including the fierce huntress Atalanta, whom he fell deeply in love with. The hunt was long and bloody, and many heroes died. Finally, Meleager killed the boar, but in a controversial decision, he awarded the boar's hide to Atalanta, because she had been the first to wound it. This angered his uncles, who believed the prize should go to them. In the ensuing argument, Meleager, in a fit of rage, killed his 2 uncles. When his mother Althea heard what her son had done, she was consumed by grief and fury. Her brothers were dead, killed by her own son. In her despair, she remembered the prophecy of the fates. She went to the chest, took out the half-burned log, and threw it back into the fire. As the last embers of the log turned to ash, Meleager, far away on the battlefield, felt a sudden searing pain in his chest. He collapsed and died, his life extinguished by the very log that had been meant to protect him. Althea, realizing the terrible thing she had done, was overcome with remorse and took her own life. The prophecy had been fulfilled, not by some external force, but by the very actions taken to prevent it. Meleager's fate was sealed the moment the fates spoke, and no amount of human intervention, no mother's love, no hero's strength could change it. The log was merely a symbol, a physical manifestation of an unbreakable thread that had been spun and measured long before he was born. This story was a chilling reminder that in the Greek world, you were not the author of your own story. You were merely a character, playing a part in a cosmic drama that had already been written. The threads of fate were invisible, but they were stronger than any chain. To struggle against them was futile. To accept them was the only path to a semblance of peace. But even then, peace was a fragile thing, for the fates were always watching, their shears ever ready to snip the thread of life, bringing an end to the story, no matter how unfinished it might seem. In ancient Greece, death was not the end of the journey, it was merely a transition. But it was a transition fraught with peril, a journey to a dark and shadowy realm known as the Underworld, ruled by the grim god Hades. To ensure a peaceful passage for the soul, and to avoid the terrible fate of wandering the earth as a restless ghost, proper burial rites were not just a custom, they were an absolute necessity. To die without a proper burial was to be condemned to an eternity of suffering, a fate far worse than death itself. The rituals surrounding death were precise and sacred. The eyes of the deceased had to be closed, and the body washed and anointed with oils. A coin, an obol, was placed under the tongue of the deceased. This coin was the payment for Charon, the ferryman of the dead, who would row the souls across the river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Without this payment, the soul would be stranded on the wrong side of the river, forever longing for passage. There is a tragic story that illustrates the dire consequences of an improper burial, the tale of Elpenor, one of Odysseus's companions. Elpenor was not a hero or a great warrior. He was a simple man, known for his love of wine and his lack of foresight. During their stay on the island of Circe, the sorceress, Elpenor, in a drunken stupor, decided to sleep on the roof of Circe's palace. The next morning, when Odysseus and his men were preparing to leave, Elpenor, startled by the commotion, forgot where he was. He fell from the roof, broke his neck, and died instantly. In their haste to leave Circe's island, Odysseus and his men did not give Elpenor a proper burial. They simply left his body where it lay. They sailed away, unaware of the terrible fate they had condemned their companion to. Later, when Odysseus journeyed to the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias, he was shocked to see the ghost of Elpenor. The poor soul was a pitiful sight, a shadowy figure, unable to cross the river Styx, forever trapped in a state of longing and despair. Elpenor's ghost pleaded with Odysseus. He begged his former commander to return to Circe's island to find his unburied body and to give him the proper funeral rites. He asked for his body to be burned, his armor to be buried with him, and a mound of earth to be raised over his grave with his oar planted on top as a marker. Only then, he explained, would his soul be able to find peace and cross into the realm of Hades. Odysseus, deeply moved by his companion's plight, promised to fulfill his request. After his journey to the underworld, he returned to Circe's island, found Elpenor's body, and performed all the necessary rituals. Only then did Elpenor's soul find its rest. His story was a stark reminder that the living had a sacred duty to the dead. To neglect these duties was to condemn a soul to an eternity of torment. The fear of an unburied body was a powerful motivator in Greek society. Soldiers would risk their lives to retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades. Families would go to great lengths to ensure that their loved ones received a proper burial, even in times of war or plague. The rituals were not just about honoring the dead, they were about protecting the living. A restless ghost, a soul denied passage to the underworld, could haunt the living, bringing misfortune, sickness, and even death. The proper burial was a final act of love, a last farewell, and a crucial step in maintaining the delicate balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Once the proper burial rites had been performed, the soul of the deceased began its terrifying journey to the underworld. This was not a journey for the faint of heart. It was a descent into a realm of eternal twilight, a place of shadows and whispers, guarded by fearsome creatures and crossed by treacherous rivers. The underworld was not a place of fire and brimstone, but a place of cold, damp gloom, a mirror image of the living world, but stripped of all its color and warmth. To enter Hades was to leave behind all hope, all joy, and all memory of the sunlit world. The first obstacle was the river Acheron, the river of woe. Here, the souls of the dead gathered, a vast, silent multitude, waiting for Charon, the grim ferryman. Charon was an ancient, unkempt figure with a long white beard and piercing eyes. He demanded his payment, the obol that had been placed under the tongue of the deceased. Those who had not received a proper burial, those who had no coin, were left to wander the banks of the Acheron for 100 years, forever longing for passage, their ghostly cries echoing through the desolate landscape. Beyond the Acheron lay other rivers, each with its own terrifying significance. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, flowed with the tears of the unburied dead. The Phlegethon, the river of fire, burned with a silent internal flame. The Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, offered a chilling mercy to those who drank from its waters, erasing all memories of their mortal lives. And finally, the Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths, whose dark waters were so sacred that even the gods swore by them. But the rivers were not the only guardians of the underworld. Beyond them lay the gates of Hades, guarded by a monstrous beast, Cerberus, the three-headed dog. Cerberus was a terrifying sight, with a mane of snakes, a lion's claws, and a venomous tail. His job was to prevent the living from entering the underworld and the dead from leaving. He was a loyal and ferocious guardian, and only the bravest heroes, or those with divine assistance, dared to face him. There is a story about Orpheus, the greatest musician of all time. He was immortal, but his music was so beautiful that it could charm beasts, move trees, and even melt the hearts of the gods. His beloved wife, Eurydice, died from a snakebite, and Orpheus, consumed by grief, decided to do what no mortal had ever done before. He would descend into the underworld and bring her back. He approached Charon, who initially refused him passage. But Orpheus began to play his lyre, and the music was so mournful, so beautiful, that even the grim ferryman was moved to tears. He rode Orpheus across the Acheron. Orpheus then faced Cerberus. The three-headed dog snarled and barked, ready to tear him apart. But Orpheus played his lyre again, and the music was so soothing, so enchanting, that Cerberus fell into a deep sleep, allowing Orpheus to pass. Orpheus continued his journey, his music charming the Furies, the terrifying goddesses of vengeance, and even the stern heart of Hades himself. He pleaded his case, and Hades, moved by his music and his love, agreed to let Eurydice return to the world of the living. On one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead of her, and he must not look back until they had both reached the sunlight. Orpheus, overjoyed, agreed. But as they neared the exit, he began to doubt. Was she really behind him? Was Hades playing a trick? Just as he stepped into the light, he turned to look. In that instant, Eurydice, still in the shadows, was pulled back into the darkness, lost to him forever. Orpheus's journey was a testament to the power of love and music, but it was also a chilling reminder of the absolute and unyielding rules of the underworld. It was a place of no return, a realm where the living did not belong, and where even the greatest heroes could lose everything with a single, fatal glance. The journey to Hades was a one-way trip, and its guardians were merciless. To enter was to surrender all hope, and to leave was a miracle that rarely, if ever, occurred. Once a soul had successfully navigated the treacherous rivers and passed the fearsome guardians of the underworld, their journey was not yet complete. The realm of Hades was not a single, undifferentiated place. It was divided into different regions, each reserved for a specific type of soul, a final destination determined by the life they had lived. There was no single heaven or hell. There were shades of gray, and the afterlife was a reflection of the choices made in the mortal world. To die in ancient Greece was to face a final judgment, and your eternal resting place depended on the verdict. The most desirable destination was Elysium, also known as the Elysian Fields. This was a paradise, a place of eternal spring, filled with beautiful meadows, fragrant flowers, and gentle breezes. Here, the souls of heroes, the virtuous, and those favored by the gods lived a life of perpetual bliss. They spent their days in pleasant conversation, enjoying music, feasting, and engaging in athletic contests. It was a place of peace and contentment, a reward for a life well lived, a place where the sun always shone, even in the depths of the underworld. For the vast majority of souls, however, their destination was the Asphodel Meadows. This was a neutral, somewhat dreary place, a vast, gray plain covered in asphodel flowers, which were believed to be the food of the dead. Here, the souls of ordinary people, those who had committed no great crimes but had also performed no great deeds, wandered aimlessly. They were not punished, but they were not rewarded either. They were simply shadows, devoid of memory and personality, living a monotonous existence, a pale imitation of their former lives. It was a place of quiet resignation, a limbo where the echoes of life slowly faded away. And then there was Tartarus. This was the deepest, darkest, and most terrible part of the underworld, a place of eternal torment and punishment. It was a vast, bottomless pit, surrounded by a triple wall of bronze and guarded by the Furies, the terrifying goddesses of vengeance. Tartarus was reserved for the most wicked of souls, those who had committed unforgivable crimes against the gods or humanity. Here, the punishments were not just symbolic, they were physical, relentless, and eternal. Consider the fate of Sisyphus. He was a cunning and deceitful king who had cheated death not once but twice. He had tricked Hades and even chained up Thanatos, the god of death, causing chaos in the mortal world. For his crimes, he was condemned to Tartarus. His punishment was to roll a massive boulder up a steep hill, only for it to roll back down every time he neared the top. He was doomed to an eternity of futile labor, a constant, agonizing struggle that never ended. Another famous resident of Tartarus was Tantalus, the king who had served his own son to the gods. His punishment was to stand in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, forever tormented by hunger and thirst. Whenever he reached for the fruit, it would recede. Whenever he bent to drink, the water would vanish. He was to be forever tantalized, his desires forever unfulfilled. And then there was Ixion, who had attempted to seduce Hera, the queen of the gods. For his audacity, he was bound to a fiery, ever-spinning wheel for all eternity, his body constantly burning, his mind constantly tormented. These were not just stories, they were terrifying warnings. They taught that the gods were not to be trifled with, that justice, even if delayed, would eventually be served, and that the consequences of your actions in the mortal world would follow you into the afterlife. The different realms of the underworld were a reflection of the Greek understanding of morality and divine justice. They taught that every life had a consequence, and that the choices made in the fleeting moments of mortality would determine the eternal fate of the soul. To die was not to escape judgment, it was to face it, in a realm where the scales of justice were held by the grim and impartial hands of Hades himself. The punishments inflicted upon the wicked in Tartarus were not merely acts of vengeance. They were carefully crafted lessons, designed to reflect the nature of the crime committed in life. The gods, in their infinite wisdom and often cruel creativity, ensured that the torment was eternal, inescapable, and perfectly suited to the hubris or impiety that had led the soul to this darkest realm. To be condemned to Tartarus was to become a living, breathing monument to divine justice, a terrifying example for all eternity. These eternal punishments served as a powerful deterrent for mortals. They were not abstract concepts. They were vivid, horrifying tales that were passed down from generation to generation, whispered around campfires and recited by poets. They taught that the gods saw everything, remembered everything, and that no crime, no matter how cleverly concealed in life, would go unpunished in the afterlife. The justice of the underworld was slow, but it was absolute. Beyond the well-known torments of Sisyphus, Tantalus, and Ixion, there were countless others, each a unique and terrifying reflection of a mortal's transgression. Consider the Danaids, the 50 daughters of King Danaus. 49 of them murdered their husbands on their wedding night, obeying their father's command. For this heinous crime, they were condemned to Tartarus, where their eternal punishment was to fill a leaky jar with water, using sieves. Their task was endless, their efforts futile, a perfect metaphor for the emptiness of their murderous act. Then there was Tityos, a giant who had attempted to assault Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. For this crime against a goddess, he was stretched out in Tartarus, covering 9 acres of ground. 2 vultures, or sometimes snakes, would eternally feast on his liver, which would regenerate every night, only to be devoured again the next day. His punishment was a constant, agonizing reminder of his lust and his disrespect for the divine. Another example was the punishment of Salmoneus, a king who had dared to impersonate Zeus. He would drive his chariot through his city, dragging bronze cauldrons behind him to imitate thunder and throwing torches to mimic lightning. He even built a bridge of brass over which he drove his chariot, believing himself to be a god. Zeus, enraged by this blasphemy, struck him down with a real thunderbolt and condemned him to Tartarus. There he was forced to endure eternal torment, surrounded by the very sounds and sights he had so foolishly tried to imitate, a constant reminder of his hubris. These punishments were not just about suffering. They were about the complete and utter destruction of hope. The condemned knew that their torment would never end, that there was no escape, no reprieve, no possibility of redemption. They were trapped in a cycle of pain and futility, their minds and bodies forever bound to the consequences of their actions. The very nature of their punishment was designed to break their spirit, to strip them of all dignity, and to reduce them to mere shells of their former selves. The eternal punishments of Tartarus were the ultimate expression of divine justice in the Greek world. They were a chilling testament to the power of the gods, a stark warning to mortals that their actions had cosmic consequences. To live a life of impiety, of hubris, of disrespect for the divine order, was to invite a fate far worse than death. It was to invite an eternity of torment, a never-ending nightmare crafted by the very gods you had offended, a final, inescapable judgment that would echo through the ages. While mortals struggled with the dangers of the natural world, the whims of fate, and the strictures of divine justice, there was another, equally terrifying peril that often caught them in its crossfire: the petty squabbles of the gods themselves. The Olympians, for all their power and majesty, were often portrayed as deeply flawed beings, prone to jealousy, vanity, anger, and childish arguments. And when these divine disagreements erupted, the consequences for mortals could be catastrophic, turning entire cities into battlegrounds and innocent lives into collateral damage. The gods did not fight with swords and spears among themselves, not usually. Their weapons were far more subtle and far more devastating. They used plagues, famines, storms, and curses. They manipulated mortal kings and heroes, turning them into pawns in their cosmic games. A slight insult, a perceived slight, a disagreement over who was the most beautiful or the most powerful. Any of these could spark a divine feud that would ripple through the mortal world, leaving destruction in its wake. The most famous example of mortals caught in the crossfire of a divine squabble is the Trojan War. This epic conflict, which lasted for 10 long years and brought down one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, began with a simple argument over a golden apple. Eris, the goddess of discord, angry that she had not been invited to a wedding, threw a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest into the midst of the celebration." 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus, unwilling to choose between his wife, his daughter, and his sister, wisely decided to let a mortal decide. He chose Paris, a prince of Troy, to be the judge. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised him power and a vast empire. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Paris, blinded by lust, chose Aphrodite. He then sailed to Sparta, where he was welcomed as a guest in Menelaus's home, violating the sacred laws of Xenia. He abducted Helen and took her back to Troy. Menelaus, enraged by this insult, called upon all the kings and heroes of Greece to help him retrieve his wife and avenge his honor. And so the Trojan War began, a war that was not just fought by men, but by gods. Throughout the 10 years of the war, the gods took sides, openly intervening in battles, protecting their favored heroes and inflicting plagues and misfortunes upon their enemies. Athena and Hera, still bitter about Paris's decision, sided with the Greeks, actively working to bring about the downfall of Troy. Aphrodite, of course, supported Paris and the Trojans. Apollo, angered by a slight from the Greek commander Agamemnon, sent a plague upon the Greek army. Poseidon, despite his initial neutrality, eventually sided with the Greeks, while Ares, the god of war, fought on both sides, reveling in the bloodshed. The mortals, meanwhile, suffered immensely. Thousands died, cities were sacked, and families were torn apart, all because of a beauty contest among goddesses and a prince's foolish choice. The Trojan War was a brutal and bloody testament to the fact that the gods were not always benevolent protectors. They were powerful, unpredictable beings with their own agendas, their own rivalries, and their own petty grievances. And when they fought, mortals were the ones who paid the price. This was a terrifying reality for the ancient Greeks. They knew that their lives were not entirely their own. They were constantly at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves, forces that could turn their world upside down on a whim. To survive in such a world, you had to be constantly aware of the divine landscape, to try to understand the shifting alliances and the hidden grudges of the gods. But even then, there was no guarantee of safety. For when the gods squabbled, mortals were simply caught in the crossfire, their lives extinguished like candles in a divine storm. In the Greek world, words were not just sounds, they were powerful forces, especially when spoken with intense emotion and directed by a wronged heart. A curse, once uttered, was believed to be a living entity, a dark spell that could bind destiny, twist fate, and haunt generations. It was a weapon wielded by the powerless against the powerful, by the wronged against their oppressors, and sometimes by the gods themselves against those who defied them. To be the target of a curse was to be marked for misfortune, to have your life's path irrevocably altered by a spoken word. Curses were not always immediate in their effect. They could lie dormant for years, even generations, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. They were often passed down through families, a dark inheritance that poisoned the lives of innocent descendants for the sins of their ancestors. This belief in the enduring power of curses was a constant source of anxiety for the Greeks, a reminder that the past was never truly past, and that the consequences of one's actions could ripple through time. The most chilling example of a curse's enduring power is the story of the house of Atreus, which we touched upon earlier. The curse began with Tantalus, who served his own son to the gods. It was amplified by Myrtilus, the charioteer betrayed by Pelops, but it truly took root and blossomed into a horrifying saga with the actions of Atreus and Thyestes, who continued the cycle of murder and cannibalism within their own family. The curse was a self-fulfilling prophecy. a dark thread woven into the very fabric of their lineage. Consider the story of Oedipus, whose tragic fate was sealed by a curse. When Oedipus's father, Laius, was killed at the crossroads, the city of Thebes was left without a king. The murderer was unknown, and the city was plagued by the Sphinx. When Oedipus solved the Sphinx's riddle and became king, he unknowingly married his own mother, Jocasta. Years later, when a plague struck Thebes, Oedipus, in his role as king, vowed to find the murderer of Laius and bring him to justice. He pronounced a terrible curse upon the unknown killer, declaring that he would be exiled and suffer a miserable fate. Upon the murderer, Oedipus declared, "I invoke this curse, that he may wear out his life in misery for his miserable deeds." He did not know that he was cursing himself. The curse, once spoken, began to unravel the truth, leading him to the horrifying discovery that he was the very man he had cursed. His own words, spoken in righteous anger, became the instrument of his own downfall. The curse was not a magical spell. It was a binding of destiny, a declaration of a fate that would inevitably come to pass. Another powerful curse was laid upon the city of Troy by the prophetess Cassandra. She was a princess of Troy, blessed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy. But when she refused his advances, Apollo cursed her so that no one would ever believe her prophecies. She foresaw the destruction of Troy, the Trojan horse, and the death of her family. She warned her people, but they dismissed her as mad. Her words, though true, were powerless to change the fate that had been sealed by the gods. These stories taught the Greeks that words had power, especially words spoken in anger or despair. To utter a curse was to invoke the will of the gods, to set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. To be cursed was to be trapped in a narrative of misfortune, a story written by another's pain. The power of curses was a terrifying reminder that the universe was not always just, that suffering could be inherited, and that a single ill-spoken word could bind a destiny for all eternity. In a world where the future was often revealed through omens, dreams, and the pronouncements of oracles, the gift of prophecy might seem like an invaluable tool for survival. To know what lay ahead, to foresee dangers and opportunities, could surely give a mortal an advantage. But in ancient Greece, the rules of prophecy were strange and often cruel. The knowledge of the future was not a clear map to safety. It was a labyrinth, a puzzle, a riddle that often led to the very fate it sought to avoid. To know too much was often more dangerous than to know nothing at all. Prophecies were rarely straightforward. They were often ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations, and delivered in cryptic language that required careful deciphering. And even when the meaning seemed clear, the act of trying to avoid the prophecy often led directly to its fulfillment. This was the cruel irony of fate in the Greek world. The more you struggled against your destiny, the more tightly you became entangled in its threads. The gift of foresight was not a gift of freedom. It was a gift of foreknowledge of your own inescapable doom. The story of King Acrisius of Argos and his grandson Perseus is a classic example of the dangers of prophecy. Acrisius received a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi that he would be killed by his own grandson. Terrified, he tried to defy fate. He imprisoned his beautiful daughter Danae in a bronze tower, hoping to prevent her from ever having a child. But Zeus, in his usual fashion, found a way. He visited Danae in the form of a shower of golden rain, and she conceived a son, Perseus. Acrisius, upon discovering the child, was even more terrified. He dared not kill his grandson directly, for fear of angering the gods. Instead, he placed Danae and the infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, hoping they would drown. But Zeus protected them, and they were washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where they were rescued by a kind fisherman named Dictys. Perseus grew up on Seriphos, unaware of his true parentage or the prophecy that hung over his grandfather. He became a brave and strong young man. Years later, He embarked on a quest to kill the Gorgon Medusa, a monster whose gaze could turn men to stone. He succeeded and returned to Seriphos a hero. But the prophecy still lingered. Acrisius, hearing that his grandson was alive and a hero, fled Argos, hoping to escape his fate. He traveled to the city of Larissa, where athletic games were being held. Perseus, also traveling, happened to arrive at Larissa and decided to participate in the games. During the discus throw, Perseus accidentally threw the discus too far, and it struck an old man in the crowd, killing him instantly. The old man was Acrisius, his own grandfather. The prophecy had been fulfilled not through malice or intent, but through a simple, tragic accident. This story, and countless others, taught the Greeks that prophecy was not a tool to be manipulated. It was a divine decree, a glimpse into a future that was already set. To try to outsmart the gods, to try to change what was destined to be, was a futile exercise that only served to bring about the very outcome you feared. The knowledge of the future was a heavy burden, a constant reminder that your life was not your own, and that the path you walked had already been laid out by forces beyond your control. The oracles, the seers, the dream interpreters, they were not guides to a better future. They were messengers of an unchangeable destiny. And often, the most dangerous thing you could do was to listen to their words, for once you knew your fate, you were condemned to live it every step of the way, knowing that every choice you made, every action you took, was merely a step closer to an inevitable conclusion. In the world of ancient Greece, a stranger was never just a stranger. They could be a god in disguise, testing your hospitality, your piety, or your moral character. The Olympians, with their immense power and their often bored natures, frequently descended to the mortal realm, taking on human forms to observe, to interfere, or simply to amuse themselves. This meant that every encounter with an unknown person carried a hidden layer of danger and opportunity. To treat a stranger with disrespect was to risk offending a god, and to treat them with kindness was to potentially earn a divine blessing. The rule was simple: never trust a stranger, but always treat them as if they were a god. Zeus, in particular, was fond of disguises. He would often appear as a humble traveler, a beggar, or an old man, testing the xenia of mortals. His intentions were not always benevolent. Sometimes he was looking for a new lover. Sometimes he was seeking to punish the impious, and sometimes he was simply curious. But regardless of his purpose, his presence always brought with it an element of unpredictable danger. To fail his test was to invite his wrath, and his wrath was legendary. We've already seen the story of Baucis and Philemon, who were rewarded for their exceptional hospitality to Zeus and Hermes in disguise. But for every such tale of divine reward, there were countless others of divine punishment. Consider the story of Lycaon, the king who tried to trick Zeus by serving him human flesh. Zeus had come to him in the guise of a traveler, and Lycaon's impiety was revealed by his horrific act of disrespect. His punishment was swift and terrible. He was transformed into a wolf, a beast forever marked by his monstrous crime. Another chilling example is the story of the daughters of King Minos, who refused to honor Dionysus. The god came to them in the guise of a young girl, urging them to join his revels. They mocked him, and for their disrespect they were driven to madness and transformed into bats. Their refusal to recognize the divine in a humble disguise led to their tragic downfall. These stories taught the Greeks a crucial lesson. Appearances could be deceiving. The most powerful beings in the universe could walk among them, disguised as the most ordinary of mortals. This created a constant state of vigilance, a subtle paranoia that permeated daily life. You could never be entirely sure who you were speaking to, who was listening, or who was judging your actions. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, carried the weight of potential divine scrutiny. This rule extended beyond just the gods. Nymphs, Satyrs and other mythical creatures also had the ability to disguise themselves, often with mischievous or malevolent intentions. A beautiful maiden by a spring could be a water nymph, a charming shepherd could be Pan, and a friendly old woman could be a vengeful witch. The world was full of hidden dangers and hidden powers, and the only way to navigate it safely was to assume that everyone you met was more than they seemed. So, when a stranger knocked on your door, you opened it with caution and respect. When a traveler asked for directions, you gave them with humility. When a beggar asked for alms, you offered them with generosity. You did not ask too many questions. You did not boast, and you did not judge. You simply offered what was expected, and you hoped that your actions would be pleasing to whatever divine being might be hiding beneath the cloak of a mortal disguise. For in ancient Greece, the line between the human and the divine was thin and permeable, and a single misstep in judgment could lead to a fate far worse than any mortal punishment. In the fluid and unpredictable world of Greek mythology, one of the most common and terrifying forms of divine intervention was transformation. The gods, in their boundless power, could change a mortal into anything they wished: an animal, a plant, a stone, a constellation, or even a body of water. These transformations were rarely benevolent. They were usually punishments, acts of vengeance, or desperate attempts to protect a mortal from the wrath of another god. To be transformed was to lose your identity, your humanity, and often your very voice. It was a permanent and inescapable alteration, a living monument to divine power. These stories of transformation served as powerful cautionary tales. They taught that the gods held absolute dominion over the very fabric of existence, and that mortals were merely temporary forms, easily reshaped and redefined at the whim of the divine. They also highlighted the fragility of human identity, a reminder that your form, your voice, your very being could be stripped away in an instant, leaving behind only a shadow of what you once were. We've already seen several examples of transformation. Actaeon turned into a stag, Arachne into a spider, Lycaon into a wolf, and the daughters of Minyas into bats. Each of these transformations was a direct consequence of a mortal's transgression against a god. But there were other reasons for transformation as well, reasons that were equally terrifying. Consider the story of Daphne, a beautiful nymph who was a devoted follower of Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. Daphne had sworn to remain a maiden forever, rejecting all suitors. But she caught the eye of Apollo, the god of music and light, who was struck by Cupid's arrow and fell madly in love with her. Apollo pursued Daphne relentlessly, his divine speed allowing him to gain on her. Daphne, terrified and desperate, prayed to her father, the river god Peneus, to save her. Peneus heard her plea. Just as Apollo was about to catch her, Daphne began to change. Her skin turned to bark, her hair became leaves, her arms became branches, and her feet rooted themselves into the earth. She was transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo, heartbroken, embraced the tree and declared that the laurel would forever be his sacred plant, its leaves used to crown victors in athletic contests and poets in their triumphs. Daphne had escaped Apollo's embrace, but she had lost her human form, her voice, and her freedom. Another poignant example is the story of Echo, a beautiful nymph who was cursed by Hera. Echo was a talkative nymph, and she often distracted Hera with her endless chatter, while Zeus was off pursuing his many affairs. When Hera discovered Echo's deception, she cursed her, taking away her ability to speak her own words. From that day forward, Echo could only repeat the last words spoken by another. She fell in love with the vain youth Narcissus, but could not express her feelings. She wasted away until only her voice remained, forever echoing the words of others. These stories of transformation were not just fantastical tales, they were deeply ingrained in the Greek psyche. They were a constant reminder that the world was alive with divine power, and that the boundaries between human, animal, and nature were fluid and permeable. To live in ancient Greece was to live with the constant possibility that you could, at any moment, become something else. Your identity was not fixed, it was a temporary state, a fragile form that could be shattered and reshaped by the will of the gods. And the only certainty was that once transformed, there was no going back. Your new form was your eternal prison, a silent scream echoing through the ages. Having journeyed through the myriad dangers of ancient Greece, from the watchful eyes of the gods to the treacherous paths of the wilderness, from the volatile crowds of the agora to the inescapable grip of fate, it becomes clear that life in this ancient world was defined by one overarching characteristic: unpredictability. There was no true safety, no absolute certainty, no guarantee that tomorrow would be anything like today. Every sunrise brought with it a fresh set of perils, and every sunset left behind a trail of unanswered questions. To survive a day in ancient Greece was not just a matter of skill or strength, it was a constant negotiation with forces beyond human control. Mortals lived at the mercy of the gods, whose moods shifted like the winds and whose interventions could turn a prosperous life into a tragedy in an instant. A sudden storm at sea, a blight on the crops, a plague sweeping through the city. These were not random acts of nature. They were divine messages, expressions of pleasure or displeasure, and their causes were often inscrutable to human minds. The best a mortal could do was to offer sacrifices, whisper prayers, and hope that their piety would be enough to avert disaster. Beyond the divine, the natural world itself was a constant source of unpredictable danger. Wild animals roamed the forests, bandits lurked on the roads, and the very earth could tremble and crack open without warning. There were no reliable forecasts, no emergency services, no safety nets. A single bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire village. A sudden illness could claim a life in a matter of days. The fragility of human existence was a daily reality, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. And then there was the human element. The shifting tides of public opinion in the agora, the sudden eruption of violence, the whispers of gossip that could ruin a reputation. These were all unpredictable forces that could turn a friend into an enemy, a hero into an outcast. Justice was often swift and brutal, and the line between right and wrong could be blurred by the whims of powerful men or the passions of a mob. To navigate this social landscape required a constant vigilance, a careful balancing act between asserting oneself and remaining humble. Even the most fundamental aspects of life, like love and family, were subject to the unpredictable hand of fate. Prophecies could doom a relationship before it began. Family curses could poison generations. The very act of being born into a particular lineage could predetermine a life of suffering. There was no escaping the threads of destiny, no matter how hard one struggled. The future was not something to be shaped, it was something to be endured. This constant state of unpredictability fostered a unique worldview. It encouraged a deep sense of humility, a recognition of humanity's small place in a vast and powerful cosmos. It also fostered a reliance on ritual, on tradition, on the careful observance of customs that have been passed down through generations. These rituals were not just empty gestures, they were attempts to impose a semblance of order on a chaotic world, to create a sense of control where none truly existed. To live in ancient Greece was to live with a heightened awareness of danger, a constant sense of precariousness. It was to understand that life was a precious and fleeting gift, and that every moment of peace and prosperity was a blessing that could be snatched away in an instant. It was to accept that you were not the master of your own destiny, but merely a player in a grand, unpredictable drama, a drama orchestrated by forces beyond your comprehension. And the greatest wisdom one could acquire was the acceptance of this fundamental truth, that in ancient Greece, the only thing you could truly predict was the unpredictable. The stories of ancient Greece, with their tales of vengeful gods, tragic heroes, and inescapable fates, were more than just entertainment. They were the bedrock of their society, the moral compass that guided their lives, and the lens through which they understood the world. These myths, filled with strange rules and terrifying consequences, were not meant to frighten people into submission, but to teach them profound lessons about morality, respect, and their place in the vast and often dangerous cosmos. They were a form of ancient wisdom, passed down through generations, shaping the very fabric of Greek thought and culture. One of the most enduring lessons was the concept of hubris, the sin of excessive pride. Time and again, the myths showed that any mortal who dared to believe themselves equal to the gods, or who boasted of their own achievements without acknowledging divine favor, would be swiftly and brutally punished. This taught humility, a recognition that all talent, all success, all power, ultimately came from the gods. It was a constant reminder to be grateful, to be modest, and to never forget your place in the grand scheme of things. Another crucial lesson was the importance of piety and respect for the divine. The gods demanded worship, sacrifices, and adherence to their sacred laws. Those who neglected their duties, who mocked the gods, or who violated sacred spaces, inevitably faced terrible consequences. This fostered a deep sense of reverence, a constant awareness of the unseen forces that governed their lives. It taught that the world was alive with divine energy, and that every action, every thought, had the potential to please or displease a god. The myths also taught about the inescapable nature of fate. While mortals might strive and struggle, the stories repeatedly demonstrated that destiny was a powerful force that could not be defied. This did not mean that human effort was meaningless. Instead, it encouraged a focus on living a virtuous life, on fulfilling one's duties, and on accepting the inevitable with dignity and courage. It taught that, while you might not control the outcome, you could control how you faced it. The concept of xenia, or hospitality, was also deeply embedded in the myths. The stories of Zeus Xenius, the protector of strangers, and the terrible punishments inflicted upon those who violated the sacred bond between host and guest, reinforced the importance of kindness, generosity, and mutual respect. In a world without formal laws or institutions to protect travelers, xenia was a vital social contract, and the myths ensured that its importance was never forgotten. Finally, the myths provided a framework for understanding the unpredictable nature of life itself. The arbitrary whims of the gods, the sudden onset of plagues, the dangers of the natural world. All of these were explained through the narratives of divine intervention and cosmic order. This helped people to cope with the uncertainties of their existence, to find meaning in suffering, and to understand that even in the face of chaos, there was a larger, albeit often inscrutable, plan at work. The enduring lessons of the Greek myths were not just abstract philosophical concepts. They were practical guides for living. They taught people how to navigate a dangerous world, how to interact with their fellow humans, and how to appease the powerful forces that governed their lives. They were a constant reminder that life was a test, a journey filled with trials and tribulations, and that the path to a good life and a peaceful afterlife lay in understanding and respecting the strange, often terrifying but ultimately wise rules of the cosmos. These stories, passed down through generations, ensured that the wisdom of the ancients continued to echo through time, shaping the minds and hearts of all who listened. As the final echoes of these ancient tales fade into the quiet of the night, let your mind drift from the bustling agoras and the sacred groves, from the stormy seas and the shadowed underworld. The world of ancient Greece, with its watchful gods and its intricate rules, may seem far removed from our own, a place of myth and legend. Yet, in the stillness of this moment, perhaps you can feel a whisper of its enduring wisdom, a gentle reminder of the timeless truths woven into the fabric of these stories. Consider the quiet strength of Lycomedes, who navigated his day with reverence and caution, understanding that even the simplest actions held meaning in the eyes of the divine. Think of Ione, who learned the subtle power of appearance and the wisdom of humility in a world that judged by outward show. Remember the vast, untamed wilderness and the unpredictable sea, and how the ancients found ways to respect the forces of nature, knowing that their survival depended on a delicate balance with the world around them. Let the stories of justice, both mortal and divine, remind you of the profound consequences of our choices, and the intricate web of cause and effect that binds us all. The lessons of hubris and envy, of forbidden knowledge and the double-edged sword of hospitality, are not just tales of old. They are reflections of the human heart, echoes of the challenges we still face in our own lives, in our own quiet moments of decision. And as you settle deeper into your rest, let the concept of fate, that unbreakable thread, bring a sense of peace. In a world where so much is beyond our control, there is a quiet comfort in knowing that some things are simply meant to be. The struggles, the triumphs, the joys, and the sorrows, they are all part of a larger tapestry, a grand design that unfolds with a rhythm and purpose all its own. Allow the images of Elysium, with its eternal spring and gentle breezes, to fill your mind with a sense of peace and possibility. Even in the deepest shadows of the underworld, there were places of rest, of quiet contemplation, of gentle beauty. The journey through life, with all its perils and its wonders, eventually leads to a place of stillness, a realm where the soul can find its repose. Now, as the last of these ancient voices recedes, let your breath deepen, your body relax, and your mind quiet. The stories have been told, the lessons have been shared, and the journey through ancient Greece has come to its gentle close. There is nothing left to do but to surrender to the quiet embrace of the night, to let the wisdom of the ancients lull you into a deep and peaceful sleep. May your dreams be filled with the gentle whispers of history, and may you awaken refreshed, renewed, and ready for the dawn of a new day.